You think you know how Napoleon Bonaparte died? Think again. The man who conquered Europe, who marched armies across continents and reshaped history, didn't die in glory. He died in pure agony. His body failed him in ways no battlefield ever could, torn apart by brutal medical errors and relentless disease. In his final hours, the emperor hallucinated his own battles while his organs literally began to shut down. What actually happened in those last moments is shocking, horrifying, and almost unbelievable. And today, you're about to see the truth. Most people think of Napoleon Bonaparte as a larger-than-life conqueror, a man who bent Europe to his will, whose name struck fear into kings and generals alike. History remembers the glory, the victories, the rapid campaigns, the reshaping of nations under his hand. But what history often hides, what is deliberately sanitized in textbooks and romanticized in films, is the raw human reality of his final days. The same man who commanded millions, who inspired loyalty and terror in equal measure, was brought low not by armies or enemies, but by the slow, merciless collapse of his own body. In the isolation of St. Helena, far from the battlefields and the opulence of Paris, Napoleon's daily struggles were invisible to the world. Every step, every movement, even every sip of water became a struggle against agony. The glory, the power, the authority, all that remained were memories trapped in a body that refused to obey him. It is almost unthinkable. The mind of a military genius, capable of outmaneuvering entire armies, reduced to enduring the cruel whims of disease and decay. The contrast is staggering. Outside the fortress walls, history would remember him as the indomitable emperor. Inside, he was a man whose life was slipping away in silence, whose body was unravelling from within. The reality of Napoleon's last weeks is a brutal reminder that no matter how mighty a person may appear, physical collapse spares no one. And while classrooms and documentaries often gloss over these details, the truth is far more shocking. His suffering exposes a side of history rarely acknowledged, a reality where power, fame, and conquest cannot shield even the greatest from the inevitability of death. This is not just a story of decline, it is a story of human fragility, a stark reminder that behind the legend, Napoleon was still a man, and mortality, ultimately, had the final word. March 1821. The middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. Thousands of miles from Europe, on the windswept, isolated island of St. Helena, the man who once commanded empires faced the harshest enemy of all, his own failing body. Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor who had marched across Europe with armies at his back, now struggled to lift himself from a bed that had become both prison and battlefield. The island's rocky cliffs, the constant salt-laden wind, and the unending isolation were a far cry from the bustling courts of Paris or the wide plains of Austerlitz. Yet here he would spend the last months of his life, alone with his pain and the few loyal attendants who had followed him into exile. The distance from civilization was more than physical. It was a profound, cruel separation from the world he had shaped. Every attempt to stand left him trembling, unable to even grasp a glass of water without assistance. Meals, once consumed in minutes as fuel for conquest, now revolted him. Even the smell of bread could make him gag. Time passed slowly, each day a reminder that the greatest general Europe had ever known was powerless against the inevitability of decay. The grandeur and command that once defined him had vanished behind the walls of Longwood House. Every moment was a struggle, a negotiation between mind and body as his physical strength deteriorated and his independence vanished. The very landscape of St. Helena, stark and isolated, mirrored the collapse of an empire embodied in a single man. The world outside carried on, unaware of the emperor's decline, while history's mightiest figure endured the quiet horror of being trapped in a body that no longer obeyed. Here, on this remote island, the reality of mortality could not be denied, and every painful day brought him closer to a death that even the most brilliant strategies could not prevent. Even in his final weeks, Napoleon's daily routines hinted at the slow unravelling of a once mighty man. The emperor, who had once worked tirelessly for 18 hours a day, now spent long, agonizing hours lying in a copper bathtub, the only place that offered even a flicker of relief from the burning pain in his stomach. His valet, Joseph Marchand, watched with growing alarm as the water scalded his skin red and bubbled around him, yet Napoleon refused to leave. Sometimes he would sit in the bath for 6, even 8 hours, adding more scalding water whenever it cooled, his hands gripping the edges with white-knuckled desperation. Outside that tub, every simple motion, lifting a cup, turning in bed, walking to the window, was accompanied by waves of agony. The once fearless conqueror who had marched across Europe with armies behind him now recoiled at the smell of food. Bread, meat, even the faint aroma of wine made him gag. Meals that had once been a matter of efficiency, consumed in 15 minutes to fuel his campaigns, now became a test of endurance. The servants who had followed him for years, including Count Montholon and other loyal aides, were powerless to intervene. They watched in quiet horror as the physical decline continued, each day revealing new signs of weakness and suffering. The emperor's body, once a symbol of power and control, was now fragile and vulnerable, and the human toll of his illness was visible in every movement and expression. These early signs of decay were only the beginning, the first glimpses of a descent so severe that it would culminate in a final, agonizing collapse that no amount of historical glory could prevent. The contrast between the mind that still plotted, remembered, and demanded control, and the body that could barely obey, was both tragic and terrifying, a prelude to the horror that would soon engulf him completely. Beneath the surface of Napoleon's weakening body, a far more terrifying struggle was unfolding. While his servants and doctors observed the visible decline, the baths, the wasted limbs, the nausea, the real horror was hidden deep within his stomach. A carcinoma, a malignant tumour the size of a fist, had taken root in the lining of his stomach. It was not just any growth, it was aggressive, relentless, and merciless. Every heartbeat pushed blood into the mass, making it swell, pressing against surrounding organs, tearing tissue from the inside. Every breath, every simple movement caused excruciating pain, as if a knife had been twisted repeatedly inside him. The tumour grew like a parasite, feeding on his life, slowly devouring him while leaving the mind capable of remembering, reasoning, and commanding, painfully aware of the betrayal of its own vessel. Food, once fuel for empire-building campaigns, became poison. Swallowing even small bites triggered waves of nausea and vomiting. Internal bleeding stained his stomach and intestines, a silent, gruesome signal of the destruction taking place. Doctors of the era could only guess at the cause, relying on rudimentary treatments that often worsened his condition. But the truth was unmistakable. Napoleon's body was being consumed from the inside out. Each cell of the tumour an assassin against the very being that had once conquered nations. Pain radiated outward, transforming simple gestures into agonizing challenges, and the emperor's every move became a calculated effort to survive a body that was actively betraying him. While his mind still clung to memories of victories, strategy, and command, his body had become a battlefield no army could ever hope to win, a relentless siege that would continue until the very end. The internal war, invisible yet absolute, was the hidden truth behind every grimace, every laboured breath, and every desperate moment of his final weeks. As Napoleon's illness progressed, the once imposing figure of Europe's most feared general began to change in ways that were impossible to ignore. His arms, once strong enough to command cannon crews and lead troops into battle, had withered to the point where a servant could almost encircle his bicep with a single hand. Yet his abdomen had swollen grotesquely, bloated with fluid and twisted tissue, creating a grotesque imbalance in a body that had once epitomized precision, power, and control. Walking even a few steps became a monumental challenge. He had to lean backward to balance the unnatural weight of his stomach, each movement sending waves of pain through his failing body. His skin, once pale and taut, now showed yellowing from liver strain, bruising from internal bleeding, and a mottled appearance from poor circulation. Loyal servants, including Count Montholon and others who had followed him through triumphs and defeats across Europe, watched in silent horror. They had seen him rally troops, defy entire armies, and march across continents, yet now they could only witness helplessly as the body of their emperor betrayed him. Every feature, every contour, spoke of suffering. The gaunt cheeks, the sunken eyes, the tremor in his hands. The contrast between what had been and what remained was stark and disturbing. Witnesses recorded their fear, disbelief, and revulsion, emotions that even the most seasoned aides could not hide. The transformation was not only physical but symbolic. A body once capable of shaping the fate of nations, now reduced to a grotesque shell, an undeniable testament to human frailty. This visual decline, observed by those closest to him, was a haunting prelude to the final, unrelenting chapters of his suffering. A tragic reminder that no matter how powerful a man may be, the human body can ultimately betray even the mightiest of emperors. The air in Napoleon's chamber had become almost unbearable, thick with a mixture of decay and despair that seemed to press down on everyone present. It was not just the ordinary smell of sickness, it was the stench of tissue dying while he still breathed. The tumour inside him had begun to rot, a process known as necrosis, releasing a sickly sweet and foul odour that could not be ignored. Servants tried desperately to mask it, burning sulphur and incense in an attempt to make the room tolerable, yet the smell only mingled with the sharp tang of the copper bath water he had used to soothe his burning stomach. The British doctors, working with the limited knowledge of their time, sealed windows to prevent harmful fresh air from reaching him, believing it might worsen his condition, inadvertently trapping the oppressive odour and thick atmosphere inside. Every inhale seemed to carry with it the proof of his body's slow, unrelenting destruction. Even for those who had served him loyally for years, the smell created a sense of horror and helplessness, a daily confrontation with mortality in its most visceral form. It was impossible to ignore that the man who had once reshaped Europe, issuing commands that changed the course of nations, was now imprisoned in a body that was rotting from within. The once sharp and commanding presence of Napoleon was now reduced to gasps, groans, and the faint, laboured movements of a man who could barely endure the simple act of breathing. This was a new battlefield, one his mind could not strategize against, and it left all who witnessed it stunned into silence. The smell of death became an unspoken reminder of how even the greatest among men must eventually confront the final, unavoidable truth of human fragility. In this room, history's greatest conqueror was rendered powerless, and the reality of his body's decay could no longer be denied or sanitized. Even as his body betrayed him, Napoleon's mind remained sharp, cold and calculating, clinging desperately to the last vestiges of control he could exercise. He knew he was dying, and there was no longer any illusion of escape from the torment that had consumed his final weeks. In the quiet moments of clarity, he summoned a priest, not with fear or desperation, but with the precision of a man who had always commanded everything around him. "I know I am dying," he said plainly, almost as if discussing the weather, his voice carrying the weight of authority even in weakness. Yet even in this acknowledgement of mortality, his ego persisted, sharp as ever. With painstaking focus, he dictated his will, itemizing every detail with the same meticulousness he once reserved for battlefield strategy. Nothing was left to chance. Every gift, every bequest, every slight against an enemy was measured and calculated to ensure his presence would be felt even after death. There was a petty satisfaction in these gestures, a final assertion of dominance over those who had opposed him, and a reminder that the mind could retain power long after the body had lost it. Even as his muscles failed and his frail hands trembled, Napoleon's thoughts were of empire, of loyalty, and of vengeance. He continued to command, not armies, but the legacy of his life, ensuring that even in death he would be remembered not just as a man who had fallen, but as a figure whose presence could not be erased. The contrast between his collapsing body and the unyielding mind was stark and haunting. Those who witnessed these final confessions, the servants, the priest, and the doctors, were left in awe of the man's indomitable spirit, even as every breath and movement revealed the relentless decline of the body that had once conquered Europe. Despite the clear signs of Napoleon's suffering, the doctors attending him remained confident that their treatments would help, though in reality they only hastened his decline. Among them was Dr. Archibald Arnott, a British physician who followed the medical practices of the early 19th century, unaware of the damage he was about to inflict. Believing the emperor's digestive system could be stimulated back to health, Arnott prescribed calomel, a mercury-based medicine widely used at the time. What followed was horrifying. Napoleon's body, already weakened by cancer, reacted violently. He produced large, black, tar-like stools, streaked with blood, each one a gruesome sign of internal bleeding and further deterioration. Instead of recognizing the danger, the doctors misinterpreted these horrifying symptoms as signs of progress, convinced that the treatments were working. This pattern repeated, with repeated doses of mercury further poisoning his already failing body. What should have been gentle care became a series of brutal interventions, each one stripping away his remaining strength and comfort. The emperor, who had faced armies and bullets without flinching, now endured a new battlefield, his own colon, inflamed, bleeding, and poisoned. Each dose of medicine was an unintentional act of cruelty, and every expulsion of blood and tissue a testament to how little control he now had over his own body. His servants could only watch in helpless horror as the treatments, intended to heal, instead brought excruciating suffering and humiliation. Napoleon's mind remained painfully aware of the torment, a prisoner in a body subjected to both disease and misguided medicine. The combination of stomach cancer and mercury poisoning created a perfect storm of agony that no strategy, no intellect, and no strength could overcome. This was the cruel irony of his final days. The very hands entrusted with his care were unknowingly accelerating the destruction of one of history's most powerful men. As Napoleon's body deteriorated, his mind began to unravel under the relentless strain of pain, poison, and illness. The emperor, who had once masterminded Europe's great battles, now found himself trapped in a prison of memory and delirium. In these final weeks, he relived victories and defeats with terrifying clarity, hallucinations blending seamlessly with the reality around him. He would sit upright in bed, pointing and shouting orders to invisible troops, commanding maneuvers across battlefields that no longer existed. He called for generals and soldiers long dead, cried out for Josephine as though she was standing in the room, and demanded water and supplies as if he was still in Egypt or facing the Austrians at Austerlitz. For Napoleon, the past and present collided violently, each memory a new battlefield to navigate, while his body slowly failed him. Servants, who had once followed him with loyalty through campaigns, were left helpless, tears running down their cheeks as they witnessed their emperor's genius dissolve into frantic, chaotic motions. The sounds of shouting and commands filled the room, yet they were aimed at no one. The air was thick with the tension of unreal battles only he could perceive. The contrast between his sharp strategic mind and the physical incapacity of his body created a surreal and tragic scene. The greatest military commander in history reduced to a man fighting imaginary wars while his body bled and weakened. This mental collapse was as horrifying as the physical decay, for it revealed not just suffering, but the ultimate betrayal of mind and body. Even in delirium, however, Napoleon's instinct to lead and control remained, a haunting echo of the power he once wielded across Europe, now turned inward against his own failing body and fading consciousness. His hallucinations were a cruel mirror of his past glory, a tormenting reminder of the man he had been and the helpless figure he had become. Even as his body weakened, Napoleon's will refused to surrender. In rare moments of strength, he demanded to stand and walk, clinging to the authority he had wielded over Europe. But his legs could barely hold him. His swollen, painful abdomen made each step a struggle. On the fourth step he collapsed, and his servants had no choice but to restrain him, lifting him back to bed like a fallen child. The emperor, once feared and revered by armies and kings, now begged for his troops, for an army that existed only in his memories. Every command he gave was a desperate attempt to assert control over a world he could no longer touch. The contrast between his former power and present helplessness was shocking and heartbreaking. Witnesses watched in silence, torn between awe and sorrow, as a man who had redrawn the map of Europe became trapped in his own frail body. Napoleon's dignity, so long tied to strength and conquest, was replaced by the raw vulnerability of human mortality, leaving a haunting vision of genius defeated by the inevitability of the body's decline. As Napoleon's body continued to fail, the treatments meant to heal him became instruments of pain. British doctors, following the medical practices of the time, applied blistering plasters and chemical burns to his chest, calves and feet, believing external suffering could draw out internal disease. The emperor, already frail and swollen from cancer, screamed in agony, his once commanding body now writhing under the unrelenting torment. Mercury enemas were administered, causing violent convulsions and black, bloody excretions that further humiliated and weakened him. Every attempt to alleviate the disease only intensified it, turning the room into a theatre of suffering. Those attending him, loyal servants and physicians alike, were left helpless, watching the greatest military mind of Europe reduced to a body under siege by both disease and misguided medicine. Napoleon's digestive system, ravaged from within, could no longer tolerate the treatments, yet his mind remained painfully aware, trapped in a body that could neither fight nor escape. The cruel irony was undeniable. The man who had faced cannon fire, bullets, and countless battles now endured excruciating suffering at the hands of those entrusted to preserve his life. In the last 48 hours of his life, Napoleon's body descended into an unimaginable horror. He vomited blood and pieces of tissue, the internal decay of his stomach finally breaking through. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, swelled and bloodshot from ruptured vessels. The perforated tumour had created a literal hole in his stomach, held together only by scar tissue. Yet he remained painfully alive, conscious of every agonizing moment. The air around him was thick with the smell of rotting flesh, an unbearable reminder of the disease consuming him from within. Every breath was a struggle, every movement sparking spasms of pain that left him gasping and convulsing. Those who cared for him could do nothing but hold vigil, powerless against the relentless advance of cancer and the effects of the harsh treatments he had received. Napoleon, the man who had conquered Europe and outmaneuvered countless enemies, now faced the ultimate battle alone. His mind remained alert, yet trapped in a body that betrayed him completely, offering a stark, tragic contrast between the genius he once was and the frail, suffering man he had become. On the final day, Napoleon's body finally began to surrender to the relentless assault of disease and poison. His breathing became erratic, rising and falling in slow, laboured gasps known as Cheyne-Stokes respiration. Speech left him, and his once commanding voice could no longer call orders or issue commands. Those around him recorded conflicting last words, fragments of memories and loyalties spilling from a fading mind. But the truth was simple. His body was failing beyond repair. For 17 agonizing hours, he lingered between life and death, each breath a monumental effort, each heartbeat a fragile echo of the powerful man who had once dominated Europe. The room was heavy with fear, grief, and the stench of decay, as those who had served him watched helplessly, unable to intervene. When the moment finally came, Napoleon did not die in glory or with fanfare. He simply stopped. No dramatic final gesture, no victorious last words. The man who had reshaped nations ended as every human must, a stark reminder that no amount of power or conquest can defeat the inevitability of death. The day after Napoleon's death, the autopsy revealed the full horror that had consumed the emperor from within. When the British doctors opened his body, the stench of disease and decay was overwhelming, forcing even experienced surgeons to recoil. His stomach, almost entirely cancerous, was hard as leather, a massive tumour having eaten through the lining and perforated a hole large enough to fit a finger. White nodules of metastases were scattered throughout his intestines, evidence that the cancer had been spreading relentlessly for years. Each detail confirmed what his loyal attendants had witnessed. Napoleon had been dying a slow, agonizing death, his body betrayed by disease and worsened by the harsh treatments meant to help him. Despite the outward appearance of his historical uniform and posture, the inner reality was shocking, a battlefield that no army could conquer, a body ravaged beyond recognition. The autopsy not only explained his suffering, but cemented the terrifying truth. Even the most powerful man in Europe could not escape the merciless grip of illness. It was a final, scientific confirmation of the extreme fragility of human life. Even in death, Napoleon's body became an object of fascination, obsession, and violation. The British, tasked with handling his remains, removed organs, preserved his heart and stomach in silver vessels, and allegedly took fragments of ribs, locks of hair, and even his genitalia as curiosities. These relics were hidden, smuggled, and collected, turning the man who had once ruled Europe into a source of macabre intrigue. Historians and eyewitness accounts suggest that the desecration began almost immediately as officials and doctors sought to document and preserve parts of him for posterity or personal curiosity. While the world focused on his victories and strategies, behind closed doors, his body was dissected and divided, a grim reminder that mortality spares no one. The very artifacts meant to honour him also became evidence of the invasive, disrespectful curiosity that often surrounds death. Napoleon, the feared emperor, reduced to relics and fragments, offered a chilling contrast between the grandeur of his life and the vulnerability of the human body. His death became a story not just of suffering, but of how power and obsession persist even after life ends. Decades after Napoleon's death, an extraordinary discovery shocked the world. When his tomb was opened in 1840 to return his remains to France, his body was perfectly preserved. Skin white as marble, features recognisable, and even his uniform intact, Napoleon appeared almost as if he had been buried the day before. Scientists and historians were baffled. Some suggested the high levels of arsenic in his hair acted as a preservative, while others believed secret embalming techniques or natural chemical reactions in the tomb could explain the impossible preservation. Whatever the cause, it became yet another mystery in a life already full of them. This preservation contradicted everything his decay during the final days had promised, turning the story of his suffering into a scientific and almost supernatural puzzle. The same body that had vomited tissue, endured perforated organs, and suffered daily torment now stood as a perfectly intact relic of history. It reminded the world that even in death, Napoleon's story defied expectation, blending tragedy with a haunting, almost eerie form of immortality that continued to capture imaginations worldwide. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the most powerful man in Europe, met a fate that no army, strategy, or conquest could alter. In the end, all his victories, plans, and glory meant nothing in the face of death. His body, ravaged by cancer and cruel treatments, reduced the emperor to a fragile shell, a reminder that mortality does not bend to ambition or power. Even his mind, brilliant and strategic, could not fully escape the suffering imposed by his failing body. Throughout his final days, he clung to thoughts of France, his soldiers, and the campaigns he once commanded, but all his influence ended with each painful breath. His story reveals the stark truth that no matter how great or feared a person may be, the human body has limits, and death is the ultimate equalizer. Reflecting on Napoleon's demise forces us to confront our own vulnerability and the fleeting nature of power. In the end, the man who reshaped Europe died as all humans do, powerless against time and disease, reminding us that mortality is the one battle none can escape. As we leave the tragic story of Napoleon Bonaparte, it is impossible not to reflect on the fragile line between power and mortality. Even the greatest conqueror, the man who shaped the borders of Europe and commanded millions, could not escape the inevitability of death. His suffering, his humiliation, and the slow unravelling of his body serve as a haunting reminder that history often celebrates victories while quietly ignoring the human cost behind them. But Napoleon's story is not unique. Throughout history, powerful figures have faced terrifying ends, their bodies betraying them in ways that are as shocking as they are tragic. The lessons of these final days extend beyond fascination. They remind us that life is fleeting, that glory is temporary, and that mortality spares no one, no matter their influence. In our next story, we will explore the disturbing final moments of another infamous ruler, whose death shocked Europe in ways that rival even Napoleon's demise. The parallels are haunting, and the truths even more unsettling, proving that history's greatest figures are not immune to its most cruel realities.